We're going to go ahead and get started today. Wow, we're going to have to get a new venue next semester. Thank you all so much for being here. My apologies to those of you who are sitting on the floor, standing, kind of hovering over the tables. But thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Most of us are Lang 120 students. And as such, we have 3 goals for this semester: to engage in critical inquiry and reflection, to develop information literacy, and to communicate in rhetorically effective ways. But our hope is that these goals do not just serve us in this one class. This is not taking your English class and that's the end of it. And then we can forget about writing. The goal is that these skills will be able to transfer into your disciplinary writing. Hopefully through research writing, through literature reviews, critical analysis, annotated bibliographies, all the different kinds of writing that you'll be doing throughout your career at UNCA. And so to help facilitate that transfer, I have asked 4 professors from across campus to speak with you today about what writing looks like in their disciplines, so that hopefully you can think about how the skills that you're learning in your Lang 120 classes can help support those goals and make that transition. Just a couple of practical notes before we get started. There'll be time for each panelist to speak. I'll ask them just to introduce themselves as they begin speaking. And then afterwards, we'll open it up for questions so that you can ask what you want to know about writing past Lang 120 at UNCA. A couple of other things: there are sign-in sheets in the front as you walked in. If you didn't get a chance to sign in on your way in, sign in on your way out. Let your professors know you were here so that you get credit for that, whatever kind of extra credit or whatever it is they're offering for your attendance here today. Also, if you would please, if you are sitting on one of the black folding chairs, if you would be so kind, if you have a moment after the talk today, to just pick it up and take it out with you. And I'll be out there showing you where those go. If you could help us stack those, that would be really helpful. Yet again, I apologize for the crowdedness of the room. I'll book something bigger next semester if I realize, now that I realize that this many people will be here. So thank you so much, and I will turn it over to my panelists in whatever order they'd like to go.
Kaur. Hi everyone, my name is Angel Kaur. I am an assistant professor of neuroscience. I see a bunch of my Neuroscience 178 students here. Hello. I have a background in cell molecular biology, and so when I talk about writing in my discipline, what I'm talking about is writing in the natural sciences. Natural sciences writing can often be really technical and very dry. That being said, it does require you to be able to communicate a certain amount of expertise to different types of audiences. The kinds of writing you might do in a natural sciences course and beyond the courses that you take here can be in the form of lab write-ups that can be a little bit more formal for your professor, and they'll have specific kinds of work that you have to do there, or scientific papers. In addition to scientific papers, I also like to assign a certain amount of writing that is meant to be for people outside of the discipline. And that kind of writing would involve taking much more complicated scientific information and translating it to something that you could give to one of your classmates, and they'd be able to understand the science that was represented there. The piece that I'll talk a little bit more about is the writing of scientific papers. Scientific papers have a very specific format. So unlike the things that I would give you that are very free form, a science paper has very specific sections. You have an abstract that's going to summarize the entirety of the paper and has to follow a very particular format. Each of the sections serve a very specific purpose. And so while it is very dry writing in many ways, it's also there to serve a purpose. I feel like I'm being repetitive. And the purpose often is, I'm a scientist, I'm in my lab, I'm doing some stuff that I think is really important and interesting, and I want to be able to communicate that to other scientists and people beyond the science background. And so I have to be able to take something that I know really, really well and make it interesting to other people, which is part of what the introduction of a scientific paper is, explain exactly how I did it, which is what the methods and the results sections would be, and then explain why it matters, which is what a discussion section is. In addition to that, I need to be able to write a sort of editorial report on what I did that would grab the attention of anybody who's interested in the general ideas behind what we're studying, to be able to translate that. You would see that kind of writing in all different levels of your science courses here, starting from your very first 100 level courses. And the one thing that I always like to emphasize in meetings like this is know that your audience is different when you're writing in science writing, and the format can differ as well, but if I do nothing else, just remember when you are writing a science article, you're going to cite what you're referring to rather than quote it. So science writing does not have quotes. We paraphrase what we find and we cite it. And that is an example of how writing can be very different, even though you're still just writing in specific areas. The neuroscience program here is up and coming and has lots of exciting courses that offer you different ways to engage with science. So if you have any questions about that, I'd be happy to answer those, in addition to questions about writing in the sciences.
Awesome. Hi, I'm Ashley Moraguez. I teach in political science. I mostly teach classes on American politics, but I also teach the thesis class in our department. So I have a lot of say in like how the writing in political science in our department kind of looks in practice, at least at the end of the process. If you take political science courses, there are kind of three main types of writing you might do. The first is probably the most intuitive. It's a response paper. Generally with a response paper, you are writing to engage with the literature that you were assigned, so the readings you were assigned for class, and the point is to critique the article or the book you're reading, to make connections between that book and another argument that you read or any kind of big points in political science. And your audience is generally your professor or an expert. You can kind of assume they've done the reading and they know what you're talking about. It's a very particular kind of writing that you generally only do in classes. I think probably the piece of writing that you guys might associate the most with political science might be opinion pieces, where you take a stance on a policy or take a stance on some kind of issue, and you basically argue your point. And the point with these kinds of writing is just to convince other people. They tend to be less formal forms of writing, but you also want to show some kind of authority or expertise because you want to convince other people of your standpoint on an issue. And usually you're using evidence to do so and trying to pitch it to a really wide audience, generally speaking. So this is like an op-ed in a newspaper or something like that. Occasionally your political science classes may ask you to do writing in that kind of form. However, the modal type of writing in political science is research writing. And I think the biggest misunderstanding about our discipline is that political science is a science. So in some ways, it's a lot more like writing in the natural sciences than it would be in writing in history or the humanities. And so basically what I mean by this is that our papers are basically, you come up with an original research question, you come up with a theory to answer your research question, and you test it with data or qualitative information. But we kind of have a straitjacket that we make you write in. So our papers are very formulaic. You have an introduction, you have a section where you kind of summarize the literature or the existing research on your topic, and then a theory section where you answer your research question, give your argument, a data section where you basically say how you're going to test your argument, then a results section where you say whether you have evidence for or against your argument, and then a conclusions or implications section. And so where the creativity comes in writing in political science is in the formulation of your argument and the creativity of the data or evidence you choose to use. The writing itself is very formulaic and sometimes dry because you kind of have to fit that straitjacket in some sense. There's some variability there, but very little in practice. And the whole point of this kind of literature is to be objective. So I know you guys probably don't think about politics as an objective field, but political science in fact is. And so we do not put our biases or our political ideology into our research papers. We're supposed to, or what we're trying to do is explain the world as it is, not as it should be. And so we're creating arguments and then providing hopefully objective evidence for or against our own arguments. And we're not letting our biases or our ideology kind of influence our conclusions. It should be evidence-based conclusions. And I think that's the biggest disconnect with how political science is described in, say, the media versus how it is actually on the ground. And so objectivity is important, even though you're your concerns about politics can motivate your research, but it can't dictate how you do your research and practice. And with research, kind of your audience is a general audience. You want everybody to be able to understand it, but you're really writing for an expert audience. So you have to kind of find that right balance to please the experts and make it something that anyone can read in a class or something along those lines. And I'll leave it there.
Awesome. I'm Patrick Balls. I'm a professor in the mathematics department, and it's always kind of strange going third or not first in a panel like this because I just feel like saying ditto to a lot of what's been said already. I love the attention that is being paid across campus to all of these things that y'all are talking about already: conventions and genres and purpose and audience and authority and argument. All of these, I think, are common threads that run throughout all of our writing. I'm teaching, one of my favorite courses to teach right now is our Introduction to Mathematical Proofs, the Introduction to Mathematical Foundations in the math department. It's our sort of gateway course for the major. It's the course where you really figure out if you really do want to be a math major or not. If you think you love math, you'll know it by the end of the semester in this class. It's the first class where you really learn how to write like a mathematician. I see it as that as the central purpose of this particular course. And when you think of math writing, y'all probably know this. What genre, what kind of writing do you typically associate, stereotypically even associate with mathematics?
Scientific writing.
Okay, so it is a kind of scientific writing. Is there a particular genre of writing in math?
Nonfiction.
Definitely nonfiction, ideally. Not always the case, but ideally. Starts with a P?
Physics.
No, not physics. Ends with a roof? A proof, a mathematical proof. A mathematical proof is, in some ways, it is the core of most of the research writing that we do in mathematics. Like in these other fields that Drs. Kaur and Miraguez have talked about, there are other styles of writing. There's expository writing, there's popular mathematical writing where you're taking big ideas from math and you're popularizing them for a more general audience. But in terms of research and in terms of a lot of the writing you would do as a math major, you're writing mathematical proofs. You are writing perhaps research articles, but those articles will contain a number of proofs. And at the end of the day, a proof is really just an argument, an attempt to persuade whoever your audience is that you are correct, at least, up to some assumptions. So it is a persuasive piece. You don't think of it typically, or many people typically don't think of it as that, but when you drill down into it, when you ask what the purpose of a mathematical proof is, and asking about purpose is always a good idea, just like asking about audience. The purpose of a mathematical proof is to persuade. And then when you ask who the audience is, the question becomes, persuade whom? Who is it you're trying to win over to your side? Sometimes it might be your classmates. Sometimes it might be your professor, but ideally it's a general mathematical research audience. If you're going to do some undergraduate research, if you plan to go on to grad school in math and you get your feet wet in mathematical research, you're going to try to convince folks in the general mathematical community that you are right. Now, of course, it's not just a persuasive argument that relies on your charm or your wit or your political opinions. It relies on formal, technical, computational, and logical deduction and so forth. But it is a persuasive piece of some kind. And as you begin to work into that community, as you begin to dialogue with that community, and that's another purpose for this kind of writing, is to really write yourself into that community of writers. As you begin to write your way into this community, you become more and more an authority figure. You become more and more a professional mathematician. And I think one of the most wonderful purposes you can have for whatever writing it is you end up doing at UNCA, one of the best purposes for it is professionalizing, writing yourself into your community, becoming a member of that community, whether it's community of political scientists or neuroscientists or mathematicians, historians, psychologists, whatever it is that you end up studying at UNCA. That particular discourse community, we would call it, has its own way of writing, its own style, its own genres, its own conventions. One of the things I teach in this class that I'm teaching right now is what are the conventions of mathematical writing? Learning what kind of phrasing how you would phrase a particular idea, where the comma goes, where the equal sign goes. There's even syntax and grammar that's specific to math writing. But there's syntax, grammar, conventions, etc. and style, tone that are specific to any kind of writing. And I can't teach it all, and Dr. Miraguez can't teach it all, and Dr. Kaur can't, and your Lang 120 professors can't teach it all. So our hope is that as you leave Lang 120 and you go out into the wider world of academic writing at UNCA, you aren't going to automatically know how to write a mathematical proof or a neuroscience research paper or a historiography. You're not going to automatically know this. But we don't want you to know how to write. We want you to know how to ask what it is that will help you to learn to write in these disciplines. Know that there are conventions and styles and genres and audiences and purposes. And once you know to ask those questions, you can figure out how to answer them. And that goes a long way toward to learning to write in a particular discipline.
Thank you everybody for being here. I'm Juan Sanchez Martinez, and I am professor in modern languages and in indigenous studies, and like all of us, we collaborate with different departments, and I didn't know that this space was going to be like this. So I'm not prepared at all. I'm just trying to think what to say. I'm from Colombia, from South America, and sometimes things are understood differently in different traditions. So I'm gonna tell a brief story to talk about writing in my discipline from where I'm from. So I was like you guys, I don't know, 15 years ago, more like 18 years ago in Bogota in a university studying something that they call literature. And so I wanted to be a writer. So whatever, I don't know, I like to write poetry, you know. And when I started that BA, I found these professors, and most of them were poets and writers. But the most important courses in the major were related with critics, like literary criticism. And for some reason, the program believed that in order to talk about literature, we had to be like critical and objective, and write in a way that for me was always like hard to understand, because when I read poetry, I just wanna, you know, like feel or whatever, you know, and then if you try to write a literary criticism piece, maybe you start, I don't know, like maybe you take, you know, like the juice, and you know. I followed with that for 4 years. I graduated, you know, and I wrote my thesis. I left for months to leave to work with communities, and I wrote a thesis in a notebook because I didn't have a computer, and then I had to pass it, and I never talked with my professor who was guiding me. And then when I arrived to Bogota to present it to him, my thesis, it was like, I don't know, 150 pages about a poet. He said, "It seems that you never studied in this university." You know, that's what he said. Like, it seems that you passed, like everything that we said passed through. You know, like, and you did what you wanted to do. That was that piece was celebrated by the university, and I said, okay, I don't believe in objectivity, and all my career I have tried to, you know, like break the bridges between genres, between this. I believe that we need to locate ourselves whatever we are writing about. We need to know who we are, where are we talking from, what type of perspective are you following. So this is me, and so the rest of my career I have trying to be like bridge, like fiction, non-fiction, science, and storytelling and poetry, and I write like that. It's all disorganized. So and one of the things that you're gonna find if you want to be a scientist or write in a certain way is that not many people read it, and that's a reality. So that's why I'm concerned about audience. So who's gonna read this if I spend years writing about this? Who's gonna read it, and who's gonna be affected by? So what I do today is to write with community. I believe in a collectivity. So I work with elders, I work with friends, I publish pieces that are half interview, half poetry, half essay, and they engage people. And I also believe in translation, so the importance to like language justice. And so those are things that I do today. Right now, we are, for example, teaching a class about indigenous perspectives on the sky. And in that class that we are teaching with an astronomer, we have discussed about this and how science, there are many sciences. So there's one that is Eurocentric, and where certain things are important, but there are other ways to understand science. And so that's also an invitation. You are starting, believe in your voice too, believe in metaphor, in symbols, believe in community. If you want to write something that is heavy and that can make some impact in society. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you all very much. I want to just mention, and I'm so happy, Juan, that you spoke about collaborating with community writers, because that's something that I've heard. I've been doing the WIC panel for a few years now, and I've heard other professors in other disciplines talk about community writing projects. I know Amina Batata in health and wellness does a lot of writing with the community. So there's an example of a more science-heavy field that's doing a lot of work to communicate with community audiences and write with community audiences. So I'm really glad that you brought that up. And then of course the question of objectivity, something that is so important in so many of our disciplines, right? The questioning of that and the questioning of what that means and how to achieve that. I think are really important questions. So I have lots of questions, but I'm hoping that you do as well. So I'm going to now open it up for any questions that you have of any of the panelists.
I personally don't like writing in scientific ways and stuff like that. And when I write, I like to try to put some actual personality into my writing because it usually just feels boring. And you personally, I'm sorry, I forgot your name.
Juan.
Juan, have you gotten in trouble for writing different?
Yeah, I have trouble all the time because, there are some magazines that believe in certain ways of writing, so you are not welcome, you are suspicious, and then it's fine, but you are always gonna find, places where you're gonna find your community, and you're gonna find. And also, one of the things that we are talking about in this class with astronomers is that sometimes culture becomes invisible in certain ways of writing, and culture is present all the time. So somehow we always have a bias. We are culture, so that's something that it becomes political, because so for me it's just it's important. You know, who are you? Why are you talking about this? Yeah, that's important.
I think there's another question right here.
Yeah, you have a
I was
question?
gonna ask if any of you have a particular genre that you like to write about, even if it's straying from your discipline. And do you feel guilty for straying?
I don't really stray from my discipline, but since working here, which this university kind of values different types of writing rather than just academic writing, I've started to write for the mainstream media a little bit, which generally at another university I could do it, but it wouldn't be valued by my department or by the university community. So I've been publishing some pieces on Vox. I don't know if you guys follow Vox, but they kind of open up a blog for political scientists who want to write to a wider audience. And so this kind of gives me the possibility to take my research and it's true that a lot of people do not read scientific research. I'm talking mostly to other political scientists when I publish something, but sometimes I think at least that my research matters more generally if you care about American democracy, which I assume most people do. So I've kind of had a lot of fun straying for that, into that kind of realm of political science writing, and I probably wouldn't at some other universities. I wouldn't have that flexibility, and so it's been fun for me. I do feel guilty sometimes, though, occasionally.
Angel, do you want-
Oh, I write science. It's just, I try to create spaces for my students to be able to engage with science in different ways. And I don't have that opportunity quite as often being in the current professional space that I'm in. Perhaps when I'm further on in my career, I might take on additional writing tasks that involve non-dry science writing. But I'm really passionate about science communication. What I find often is that science writing can water down science to the point where it's not recognizable. And that happened when the graduate work that I did was a high-profile paper that got picked up by a bunch of news sources, and people would keep sending me these things, and I would read them and be like, that's not actually what I did at all. And that's a common theme that comes up. Anything that has an impact to a wider audience gets really diluted by the time it gets to the wider audience. And I find a lot of issue with that because we work really hard to create really well-controlled experiments that give us verifiable answers that are important, and blurring all of that just to make it accessible kind of loses the beauty of science. I don't think that, I don't know, I have the way that scientists think is very ingrained in me, in my personality, and so when Juan says, who are you and what's your personality, mine is that of a scientist, as it turns out. And I approach kind of everything with that same mindset of, well, what's the best controlled experiment to do this? Which can be frustrating for other people around me, but that's how I think. And so when that nuance gets lost, that because I think the value of I think everyone should think like a scientist, because the value of it is you think through problems in ways that isolates the individual variables, and you can actually understand the impact of those variables on what's happening. And that's really valuable, right, being able to do that. And when that gets washed away, I don't like it, because it takes away the value of the scientist and makes us seem like faceless white coats that are just doing something behind the glass that you don't actually care about, and that's not true. I think scientific method is something that's really important and helpful, and so in my classes I have students take scientific literature and translate it into accessible pieces, whether it's poster presentations, which have some amount of writing in them, but it's more an oral presentation, which scientists do a lot of. Most research is communicated through poster presentations at meetings, and then some of it's going to get written down and published. And I have students in one of my classes that create podcasts based on up and coming research that was particularly interesting to them, with the idea that you're taking something very scientific and making it more accessible without losing the nuance. That's kind of my thing. So I don't do a lot of writing outside of writing prompts for my students and writing scientific papers, but I try to create opportunities for that particular science communication engagement.
I like what you said, though, about where you are in your career has a lot to do with it. I think I found as my career at UNCA has evolved, my writing opportunities have evolved as well. And after a few years at UNCA, I got involved a lot in the study of composition and rhetoric, especially in the quantitative disciplines. And so I started doing a lot of work with how we communicate in mathematics in particular, but in other quantitative fields as well. And that gave me an opportunity to work with scholars in rhetoric and composition and to learn the ins and outs and the nuts and bolts of that particular field, and eventually ended up writing a textbook on writing in the quantitative disciplines and how to teach writing. And a lot of these exercises you're talking about, that Dr. Kaur is talking about, are fantastic opportunities for students in the classroom to write for different audiences with different purposes, different genres, different kinds of writing assignments, different kinds of composition, construed more broadly, multimedia composition, video composition, and so forth. I've also, having become the director of the honors program, had a chance to do a lot of work in honors pedagogy. So I write papers now in the area of honors pedagogy and administration, which is really, really exciting, let me tell you. It can be, though, because it overlaps with another passion of mine, which is diversity in education and inclusion. And so I've co-authored a couple of papers and chapters with colleagues on the issues of the way in which honors programs intersect with diversity, inclusion, and equity in higher education. And moving further beyond that, I'm looking at other ways to engage that particular passion, writing about diversity in higher education and equity in higher education. So I've had, as my career has shifted and my career goals and opportunities have shifted, that's given me a chance to write outside my area. I also write poetry for fun. That has nothing to do with Well, you're all over the place.
So writing in the sciences is, honestly, I can't comprehend it. So are there anything, things you don't like to see when it comes to writing in scientific disciplines, I guess?
So I can intersect back to something that Blaise had brought up about the idea of personality in science writing. And the problem that comes up when you're putting too much personality in science writing is it seems more persuasive than informative. And science writing at its core should be informative. It's not, here's how I feel about what I did. It's, here's what I did. Here's the data, here's an explanation of how the experiments were done. You draw your own conclusions. And so when I teach students to read science writing, what I'm having them do is look just at the figures. You're not reading all the other stuff that's written. You're looking just at the data, and you're drawing your own conclusions. And that's what the design of a science paper is supposed to be. And so I've completely lost your question. Can you restate it?
I guess things you don't like to see when it comes to writing in
Which is why I was talking about personality. It's all coming back to me. So I think that problematizing conventions of a discipline is a really good thing for us to do, but we have to understand what the conventions are and why they're there for before we can problematize them. And so part of what you're doing as you're going through your introductory courses here is learning the discipline genre specific conventions. And for us, it is less personality, more clear cut, here's what happened and here's why. Organization is really important in science writing. If there's specific sections that are meant to do specific things, if you folks that work at the Writing Center that are here want examples of formats and how you're supposed to plug science stuff into formats, I have some cool formats I can share that come from publishing sources that are science publishing sources. So like the Nature Publishing Group, which is one of the big journals that has science writing in it, like super dry science writing, has a lot of things for writers that are submitting manuscripts of like, here's how we want you to format your abstract, here's how we want you to do this, that, and the other. And I use that all the time in my teaching because it's really helpful in taking real world examples of science writing and working from there. And when I say dry, I want to point out that it's dry because it just requires you to have a certain amount of expertise to read what's happening. But I think that's true kind of across the board. And it's not dry if you just keep your Google on and just Google the words that you don't know. If you do that, it's super interesting. But I'm also a scientist, like just so much a scientist. So that
And
comes
Angel,
with it.
didn't you mention also earlier that science writing tends to prefer paraphrasing over quotes?
Yes, that's a very clear thing.
That's maybe another
Yes.
thing to think about. And yet again, there's a disciplinary reason for that, right? In the humanities, we like words. We want to see those words. We want to see that place in the text where you saw that. We want to see what that language looks like. It doesn't matter as much in the sciences, and I would say probably both the social sciences as well as the natural sciences, but maybe not as much.
It depends. So my pet peeve, going back to your question, is when somebody starts a political science paper with like a very vague quote about democracy or, you know, whatever the case may be, because I want to hear your voice in the paper. So political science has a very strong, at least in the research writing, very strong convention of using I. Like you take ownership of the argument and of the testing of the data. Like you did this work. And I know that's not the convention for every discipline. Yeah, so for the natural sciences, they don't do that, but we do. We take kind of ownership of it. And so I like you to get to the meat of your argument. And I know I called our writing dry also, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a story. So I start almost all my academic papers with an example of real world politics where the things I'm talking about actually happened. And that's how I hook the reader in. And then I can get them through the drier bits, like my statistics, by giving them that story that shows that what I'm talking about isn't some theoretical abstraction I made up and am pretending happens in the real world. So you can make these things pretty concrete. But I want to hear my students. It's not so much personality. I mean, occasionally on certain kinds of papers, my students will write an inside joke in the paper, and that's great. I love it, except not on a research paper. There's a certain, you have to know kind of how formal the assignment is. And to go back to a comment you made, like, you know, you just don't get scientific writing, that makes you normal. No one does before they learn it. It took me a long time in grad school to write correctly. And I write drafts and drafts and drafts, and I thought my advisor was just trying to, like, haze me and get me to drop out, but he was actually teaching me a very valuable lesson. So this is a skill you acquire through practice, and so for my classes, I break the process down. So you write an introduction, I give you comments, you rewrite the introduction, then you write the literature review, and I give you comments, and you rewrite it. So it's all broken down to make this whole process way more transparent. Mm-hmm. So you shouldn't have to, like, you know, assume that if you take my class, I'm going to expect you to nail this the first time. That's not how it works, and it's going to take more than 4 years to get there. I'm still learning too.
We've got a question right back there.
When you're writing a reflective paper, like on something you've read, how do you balance objectivity with subjectivity there?
Depends on what you're reflecting on, I guess,
Yeah.
to some extent. I mean, I think in a reflection, you definitely want, and this is going to vary from genre to genre or from discipline to discipline, but so it's hard to say without more context, but I think you would definitely want some personal voice in there, like Dr. Miraguez is saying. There has to be some element of the personal because you're talking about your reaction, your engagement with whatever it is that you're reflecting upon. So there is some subjectivity inherent in that request, I think.
See, it's funny for if I'm having you reflect on science, it's all evidence-based, so I'm asking you to reflect on the evidence. And so the subjectivity is really just about, were the people that wrote the paper objective about their own data? So you're really questioning their subjectivity rather than bringing yours in if you're doing a reflection for a hard science paper.
Yeah, I would say for the social sciences, or at least for political science, usually when I assign a response paper, a reflection, I'm kind of in between the two. So I'm asking you to evaluate their evidence. Like, do you find it convincing? And then to tell me why you do or you don't. So it's a little bit more analytical than it is actually subjective. But occasionally I'll just say, like, do you agree with this viewpoint? But it varies by assignment. And I would say if you're assigned a reflection without a prompt, you should ask the professor, can you use your voice? Can you use opinion? Or do you want more of an analysis or critique? Because I know I vary that by assignment and by class a lot.
Mm-hmm. Why would you like that?
No, it's that for me everything is subjective. You know, like
It's like we're a spectrum here.
Yeah.
you know, like because so even in the Eurocentric science, we are right now in these discussions really interesting about like physics and quantum physics, and then all the things that you know, like if you start going deeper or behind the numbers and the formulas, and then you start this conversation about time and space, and then you go deeper and I don't know, someone reveal, you know, that maybe behind certain ways, certain formulas, there is a belief. And then, so how are we going to talk about this? So that's is just interesting because what I do is impossible for me to separate, you know, certain types of writing of the hierarchy in the history of knowledge. So it seems that, you know, like logic and, you know, cause and consequence is celebrated in our time and in universities, but it's not the case in, you know, in this diverse world that we live. So because I research about indigenous epistemologies, the methodologies to learn, to teach, to approach reality are based on storytelling, for example, and the metaphoric mind. So for me, everything is related with you, and if you want to try to make invisible, that's great. But if you want to show it, that's great too. But it's always you.
I think we're going to end there. I know some people have some more questions, and I love that. I'm also cognizant of the fact that we are really packed in this room, and I want to make sure that we're all able to get out of here safely. Please join me in giving a round of applause for